Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for coming to join us this afternoon. Today, we're having our panel discussion on the future of .NET. I'm going to introduce our speakers and then tell you a little bit about the format for today. So first of all is Damian Edwards. He leads the program management team for .NET application frameworks at Microsoft, covering ASP.NET and ASP.NET Core, Entity Framework and Entity Framework Core, WinForms, and the .NET Base Class Library.
Wow.
It's a lot. David Fowler is a partner software architect at Microsoft on the ASP.NET team and is a creator of SignalR. He's also been a major voice in the development of .NET Core and ASP Net Core since their inception. Julie Lerman is a leading authority on Entity Framework, about which she has written books and authored multiple Pluralsight courses. She is a Microsoft Regional Director, Domain-Driven Design Advocate, and Docker Captain. Scott Allen is also an author, Pluralsight author, and Microsoft Regional Director. On the side, he blogs, hosts a podcast, and presents at conferences around the world. And I'm Bryan Hogan. I have a podcast, a blog, and I have a few more presentations this week. The format for the discussion today is the following. I've prepared some questions, 2 for each of the panelists. I'm going to give them a few minutes to answer the question directly and then open it up to the rest of the panel for a couple more minutes before moving on. I aim to leave 15 to 20 minutes for audience questions, and we have some volunteers to move around with microphones. I will ask you, the audience, to keep your questions brief and clear when that time comes.
And not too personal.
All right, so my first question goes to Damien. What are you most happy with or excited about in .NET Core 3?
Wow. As folks probably know, I hope they know, there's a lot of stuff in .NET Core 3. Like we did a thing this morning about stuff that people may not know much about, and that we filled an hour with rapid fire stuff. I could say, the desktop stuff is super exciting because we're enabling, existing app types and new workloads on .NET Core on Windows. Obviously Blazor, but everyone's heard that. Yes, Blazor is exciting. It's going to be great, but I'm not going to give that as my answer. And there's a whole bunch of wonderful stuff. But the thing I'm actually most excited about, it says happy or excited. I'm going to pick excited because excitement doesn't necessarily mean that it's all going to be great. It's actually going to be a little bit scary. But I am most excited about is what we're doing with regards to thinking more about how we integrate and leverage open source. Now, obviously, .NET Core has been open source since almost the beginning. But over time, we've been looking at different ways and thinking about, we've had a couple of failed experiments with how we integrate with open source. So templates is a good example. We have, up until now, we've shipped Newtonsoft.json in our templates, and we've actually shipped it as part of the framework, which is not the case now in 3.0. And so we're making some changes with regards to how we think about what is the core platform of .NET Core and ASP.NET Core, and then how we layer on dependencies and extra functionality on top of that. There's been a realization, certainly in the app frameworks team, on my team, that we can't do it all by ourselves. We want .NET to be a platform for any developer to build anything they want, and we can't do that with the team size that we have at Microsoft. Like we have a certain type of thing that we need to be able to deliver and focus on, and then we really need the wider .NET ecosystem to make .NET as great as it can be. But we also want to deliver end-to-end solutions to customers for the most important challenges that they have, and that means sometimes really embracing and even recommending particular .NET open source libraries. And so we're going through a process of right now figuring out a good framework for doing that. So you'll see some new things that might ship in some of our templates in .NET Core 3. We've done a great effort with gRPC where we actually partnered with the Cloud Native Foundation and Google to build an alternate implementation of gRPC for .NET Core built on top of ASP.NET Core. And we're shipping that in the box in .NET Core 3, even though it's not technically owned by Microsoft, even though we wrote most of the code. So that's a new area for us. We haven't done that before. And for me, this is just the beginning of the next phase of .NET open source. So I'm super excited about that.
What are other people excited about?
Blazor.
Takes the easy way out.
I had to say it.
Okay.
Can you expand on why?
Oh no, so I was kidding, but Blazor honestly is looking like a very promising model for developing client-based applications. The excitement is kind of insane. When I first saw it, I was blown away. I saw it here last year. Right? It was here last year.
Oh, no.
3 years ago. No, sorry, 2 years ago.
2 years ago.
2 years ago. Where me, Steve, and Damien sat down for like lunch, and Steve was like,
I got a thing.
Yeah, and
Can I show you?
I'm really,
Okay.
huh? And then he showed it, and we were like, "You did this like overnight?" No, it took like 3 months, but whatever. It was amazing, and the reception has been kind of crazy. I think like I never expected it to be that well like accepted in the community. So I think it is very promising going forward. And then looking towards things like native development, there's actually a thing called is it kind of public yet? Blutter. That
That's not public yet.
okay, there's a
That's
thing
not
that
public yet.
that got hacked.
Rewind.
That got
Shut
hacked
down
together.
What has Scott got to say? Or Julie, what have you got to say?
So anyway,
The
I'm
future.
excited about WinForms, to be honest.
Oh,
It
good.
sounds goofy, but there's applications out there that I have that are still WinForms that have never been ported because what would you port them to? And it's just, in a way, it's kind of exciting that Microsoft is looking at these older technologies and moving them forward. I think it's awesome.
Julie, do you have something in particular?
Well, one of the connected to this is the fact that Entity Framework, not EF Core, but Entity Framework, is being fixed up to work on .NET Core 3. I actually, I had to see. I haven't used EF6 in so long. I was like hitting my head on my desk so much going, how do those initializations work again? I forgot everything. I'll go watch my course or something. But I was like, I got to see this. So I actually did. I, created a little Asp Net Core 3 app. I did the whole thing on my Mac, right?
That's cool.
On my Mac, but in Mac OS, not Parallels. Whole thing on my Mac with EF6.3 and an Asp Net Core 3 app using dependency injection. And then, of course, I had to add in SQL Server for Linux on Docker. Like it was amazing that I could do all of that on a Mac.
Okay.
It's pretty awesome.
Cool.
All right, I'll move on to the next one for David. Can you talk about some of the major performance improvements in .NET Core 3? Things like HTTP2, tiered compilation, fast JSON, and the like?
I'll talk about different stuff.
Sure.
I think it's more fun.
No, that's fine.
So
Whatever you think.
the JSON serializer is actually a big one for me. It's the first time I've seen an asynchronous JSON parser that doesn't allocate at all. It literally only allocates the objects that that are being produced. It was a kind of a big effort on our team to make that work end to end, and the benefits are showing up now in our benchmarks. So our JSON benchmark, I think, is like 2x faster because it's new async parsing, and there's no blocking in the entire pipeline. I think that's super impressive. The thread pool actually got some pretty good improvements as well. So if you're in an async state machine and you await over and over and over in the same async method, it will never allocate. It'll allocate once and then never again. And that's due to having this new interface called iThread pull work item that we showed this morning in our talk. And we now implement that interface on the state machine itself, so we can kind of queue the continuation over and over to the same object over and over. Some more improvements in Asp Net Core. We made the plain text benchmark for middleware and routing allocation free. So if you don't have any route parameters, or if you don't have any MVC in the pipeline, we literally allocate nothing once you have a connection running. That was a big effort with me and Ben and the BCL team to add a bunch of primitives to that all came together to make this beautiful end-to-end where we don't allocate anymore. Beyond that, I'm thinking of what else did we do that was kind of big in 3.0.
I was reading about there's some improvement in garbage collection.
The memory defaults.
Yeah, the memory default. So the GC in since .NET, I guess, 2 or whatever, was kind of greedy about memory. So server GC really means I am the process on the machine that's going to eat all the memory. So if you have more than one, well, guess what? 2 people are fine for memory. So in the new world of containers, people were seeing issues where you set a container limit to a very small value, and it wouldn't work super well. So in 3.0, we spent a bunch of time trying to figure out what are better smart defaults for container-based environments. And now you can say, GC, I want you to use this much memory as a max, so 500 megs of memory, for example, and it will respect that limit and kind of act accordingly. So GC limits was a big one. Tiered compilation, it's funny, we spoke about this theoretical thing. The JIT was always a trade-off between a slow startup or fast throughput. And over the course of .NET, there were kind of different trade-offs that were being made. So NGen is a super common thing that happens in .NET, where you pre-JIT the assembly before it runs, so you don't pay for your JIT time. There were issues where NGen would generate code too hard, so you couldn't. It was version brittle, is what it was called, brittle NGen. So the code name was. So we made a new tech called ready to run. And the issue with that was since you couldn't super engine anymore, it was slower. So we had to invent a third thing, tiered compilation, that mixed with this less brittle engine to JIT more after the fact, right? But the whole theory was if you can JIT in tiers. So you start off with really slow code, you JIT very fast, so you get fast startup. You JIT very slow code, and then as you get further along, the tiering from tier 0 to tier 1 to tier 2, you generate better code, right? So tiered compilation came in .NET Core 2.2. It turns out it makes some things slower, so it was off by default. In 3.0, it's now on by default because we figured out a good place to put it by default.
I saw that System.console has received improvements as well, strangely.
It did.
It did. It's
It's got new
What
colors.
improvements?
There's also a bunch of Linux stuff.
It got
right?
faster.
So we had like part of the cross-plat stuff. We've Windows. It's no secret. Like .NET's still a bit faster on Windows for a lot of scenarios. It has a 20-year pedigree, and so a lot of the Linux implementations are newer. So we've been learning as we go. And in 3.0, there's even further.
Yeah,
The thread pool,
that was a good one.
networking.
There was a change made like last week, where
I wasn't even thinking of that new, but that's fantastic.
string comparisons that were case insensitive on Linux were 20% slower, and it was this super obscure issue with p invoking on Linux,
Right.
and it's fixed now. So we're trying to go through and figure out how to close the gap between the two OSs, because people still see us as being Windows first, and we kind of still are for the most part. This morning you had the bitness as Windows x86. Mm-hmm. That's just your default is to assume Windows,
I'm on a
right?
Windows machine,
You just
so I
assume
didn't
Windows.
want to put a demo that
You should
wouldn't
have
work
put Linux.
on my machine. Okay, I should have done Linux. So make a point. That's a fair point.
Yeah.
Julie or Scott, do you have anything about performance coming in that tree that interests you?
I think they covered everything I was interested in. Faster is always better.
Yes.
All right, then I'll move on. My next question is for Julie. What changes in Entity Framework Core 3 are you most happy with, and where do you see Entity Framework going over the next few years?
Well, my ideas of what's new and great, what's great about changes in EF Core 3 might be different than other people's. There's this one little change I've been waiting for, I'm so happy about, which is for the complex types. So anybody here who uses DDD and loves value objects, there was something that just did not work, even though we could use the new, oh my gosh, I called them complex types, owned entities, the new owned entities feature. So I use that to write and support Entity Framework to be able to map value objects. But there was some really important facets of how value objects work and use that it didn't support. So we came up with a little workaround hack for it. So that was fixed. I don't think I need to go into the details about that. So I'm just really happy because as EF Core has evolved, its ability to support the way I want to write my domain models, Entity Framework Core has just gotten better and better so that Entity Framework can actually create the right data model and map directly into the database where I don't have to say, there's too much conflict here, I'm going to have to make a separate data model and map it. So it just keeps getting better and better. One thing that's really important that's going on with EF Core 3 is that they're rewriting the query engine, how the query compilation happens. And they're doing that because there's a lot of conflicts with what methods get compiled for client-side evaluation and what methods get compiled for server-side evaluation, and how a lot of those defaults were working. And a lot of that, how that worked, was carried forward from Entity Framework, and they hadn't really paid a lot of attention to it before. So since EF Core has just gotten so much stronger, I mean, as of EF Core 2.2, I thought it was like really super duper production ready, like no question. It was really, really strong. And so now they're able to really go back and start focusing on some of these other things. So they're rewriting how the query compilation works. Unfortunately, it's like, when your kid breaks their arm, you take your kid to the doctor, and the first thing the doctor has to do is break it again so that it sets properly. So like right now, they're actually recommending be really careful with Preview 6 because there's a lot of things that aren't working because they're so busy revising that query that query pipeline. But it's really, really important. It's amazing that they're able to take the time to do that right now.
Will it feel very familiar to .NET? Sorry, to Entity Framework Core 2? Will Entity Framework Core 3 feel very similar? Will it be the same syntax? Will you have to change stuff?
There's actually a big list of breaking changes right now, but the team has been really fantastic about listing them very carefully, explaining why the breaking change is happening, explaining what is you can do to go around it. I don't know how that's going to work out when EF Core 3 actually comes out. So like big new features, like from my perspective, I mean, there's not a lot of new like important features. It's more of the stuff they're finally getting to go back and dig in and make what they have even better.
Damien, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'm actually, I mean, everything Julie said there is actually the vast majority of the focus of the team at the moment, and they're doing a lot of hard work on that. I'm, again, kind of excited about the provider landscape, and so we were lucky enough to hire engineer who wrote the Postgres provider, and so now he works on the EF Core team, which is fantastic, and he's bringing a lot of that, which has been wonderful for us because one of the reasons we've done so well in the Tech Empower benchmarks is that the predominant database there is Postgres on Linux, and his provider was really good. And when we did a big performance push for the last round of Tech Empower, he really pushed hard to improve the Postgres driver, in coupling with the EF team at the time. And now we're bringing a lot of that learning and we're pushing some of those things down into ADO.NET itself. And we're adding new capabilities to ADO.NET based on what we've seen the other frameworks do in those benchmarks as well. And so things like batching, query batching and query pipelining so that you can optimize the connection between your app server and the database at the database driver level for .NET. And
Is that related to why the data client,
SQL client?
why SQL client was kind of pulled out?
So that's a different story. Do you want to hear that story?
You can tell me another day.
I can do a very short version.
Briefly, yes, please.
So the Microsoft SQL client was recently announced, I think like last month, we announced that the Microsoft SQL client will be the one that's in .NET Framework and the one that currently ships in .NET Core and as a package will basically be frozen. That one will be there forever. So if you've got an app that's using that, it's fine. And then they have pulled an EF, like EF did, however many years ago, and they're building an out-of-band version, which is the same API to start with, but they've changed the namespace. It'll be Microsoft whatever it is .SQL client, and that'll be in packages. And they're doing that so that they can create agility. The problem today is that it's the same code base and the same client in .NET Framework as it is in .NET Core. And that makes it very difficult to make changes because if you make a change, you get it wrong, you break 1.5 billion machines.
On full framework.
On full framework, because it's part of Windows. And it turns out that in .NET Framework Update 4.7.3 or whatever it was, SQL Client made a change and unfortunately broke EF and broke a bunch of things. And so there was a huge fire drill. And this kind of set the thing in. Plus, there was features that we didn't have in the SQL client in .NET Core, and that was, again, due to these type of complexities. So decoupling it is going to enable them to do much better work, much quicker, without that risk. So I'm super excited about that as well.
And I think it'll be a benefit to third-party.
Yeah, and then and another way, the other thing is that it kind of puts it on equal footing. So like the SQL client isn't in the box anymore. EF isn't in the box anymore in .NET Core 3. Obviously the tooling suggests EF, the templates will have EF, but it's not part of the framework. So if you don't use EF and use Dapper or something else, which is great, you won't pay the cost of it being in the framework. And if you don't use SQL, use Postgres or MySQL or something else. Cosmos DB, whatever it might be. That client is not there because you didn't reference it. So, yeah, it's pretty cool.
You have something
I think that's important for EF to go beyond relational databases. I mean, 10 years ago, if you asked me to store data, I would say relational database. That's the only way to go. Then 5 years ago, I started using Mongo on a regular basis. And these days, when I look at solutions that I have and working on, there's SQL Server plays a part. But then there's a lot of stuff in a NoSQL database, and there's stuff in a Redis cache, and there's a lot of stuff, honestly, actually it's sitting in CSV files and blob storage, because all it's going to do is get crunched and slammed together in an Apache Spark cluster. So why pay for a SQL Server when it can just sit in blob storage for cheap? But at the same time, sometimes it would be nice to interact with that data using code. And I keep thinking if the Entity Framework could provide something like the F# type providers, where I can get to that stuff in a strongly typed manner, and yeah, maybe do some query translation to make things more efficient, that would be awesome.
All right, I'll move us on. For Scott, a lot of people want to see C# and .NET evolve even more quickly, but do you worry that leaves a lot of people behind?
I don't think people getting left behind is as much of a concern as it was, let's say, during the .NET framework days. Just I do see a lot of even the bigger companies now understanding the fact that this new world, this new industry is going to move fast. They have to embrace open source projects that are getting updated and deprecated on a regular basis. They have to work with, if they want to work with the latest technologies like C# and .NET Core, there's going to be frequent updates, and if they don't stay up to date, then there's ramifications for that. I do worry sometimes that people get confused. I mean, if you walk into a shop that hasn't been closely paying attention to Microsoft, they're still thinking about .NET Framework, and they're thinking that's the future of the .NET Framework, and they don't understand the relationship between .NET Framework and .NET Cores yet, and it just takes a little bit of explaining to get them over that hurdle, and then they're fine. But I think we have had some confusion in the industry just with the different directions we're going.
Julie, do you see that with Entity Framework? Like we're talking about breaking changes again. Is that a concern for you?
It's not for me personally, because I also know this is. I mean, right now the breaking changes are there because they're in the middle of working on it, right? In the previews, and that explanation that I have about the broken arm, I use that with a lot of things, but I think it's really important to just be patient and let them get there, but get there with what they're doing. So I don't think that anything is for production. By the time it's released, I mean, just don't use previews in production. And
How do we get feedback?
Can I? Is it okay if I just say duh? It's not offensive to anybody. Like, don't use previews in production. I mean, it's hard because people want to get ready for a new release. So they're at least the team has said, here's what's going on with Preview 6. If you really, really need to see these other features and you want to test it, that's fine. But just be really, really aware of it.
David and Damien?
Do use previews in production.
Use previews as much as you possibly
Just not
can.
EF6 right now.
Don't call support if you have a problem. I mean, the preview thing is super interesting. Like we've done a lot of frequent previews for 3.0. We're at the point where we're doing monthly previews, and we're ramping down to release in September right now. But using previews is actually super critical. Using them in production is a whole different thing. Right.
But testing and feedback.
Testing and feedback is super, super important for us. Because the reality is, given the way .NET works, speaking about breaking changes, if we don't get the feedback before we mark it as non-preview, it's done.
Oops.
Like the only way to apply your feedback for a lot of cases is to make a break. And that usually makes a lot of people upset if it's in quite a mainline scenario. So we really appreciate folks using the previews and being very vocal with their feedback, even if it's great stuff, I love what you're doing here, I don't have any other feedback except this works really well. That's actually really important for us because being blind to it is actually one of the biggest problems that we have as a team. I'm happy to say that 3.0 is one of the highest used previews we have ever had in the .NET Core era. So we've been super happy with that. Like genuinely, really, really happy to see those numbers. So.
I'm worried. From Asp Net Core 1.0 to 2.0, we made a huge breaking change to the off stack, and it was painful. It was pretty terrible. So we've been very, very wary of doing that from 2 to 3, but we have made a series of smattering of breaking changes across the board. Some small, some big, and we think they're not a huge deal, but I feel like we're still trying to figure out if it's okay to do it. Like we keep saying, major versions, breaking changes, it'll be fine.
We don't say it like that. We're very careful.
Yeah.
When Damien's not there, we go, break it all. Damien's here. Damn it. It's not break today, guys. But we are trying to see if it's okay to break things that we think aren't used very heavily. In the past, people assumed that everything was heavily used, so we couldn't deprecate anything. So things just got blurred by nature of that. But now we're trying to dip our toe in to see, 1 to 2, you can't break an entire public API that is the mainline use case. But what if we can break this namespace over here, or that one over there, or this thing over here that isn't so popular, to see if we can actually evolve things without having to be carry the cross forever, right?
And that's one of the big differences between .NET Framework and .NET Core is that .NET Framework, you just can't break anything because it's in place, it's on Windows, you break it, you make 1.5 billion people sad. .NET Core, you get to choose when you take the change, modular support, which is I'm sure we'll end up talking about, but we can do side-by-side releases, you can take a major release when you want to take the major release, but to Julie's point before, and Scott's point, you have to adapt to how the industry is moving right now. Things are moving quicker, but there are lead times. Like it's not that we tell you 1 week, oh, we've just dropped support for this and you have to adopt the next thing next week. If you keep in tune and at least your finger on the pulse such that you're not forgetting about, keeping up to date years at a time, you do have quite a lot of runway, right? And so with the LTS supports for .NET Core, you get 3 years, and there's 2 years in between each release. Like that's a fair amount of time. And the breaks it's not replat. It's like, there's a list of breaking changes and you go through and you make those changes and then you're on the new version.
The thing is, our tools don't help you.
No, we have to work on that part.
If you weren't reading our blogs or on Twitter or if you weren't in social media, how would you know that LTS is going to expire next week?
That's right. And we've been talking about that.
I'm going to move us on.
Yeah.
Back to Entity Framework. And Julie, do you find companies are still reluctant to adopt Entity Framework, and what can be done about that?
I could just say no, and then we can move on.
Oh, no, Scott, I saw Scott nodding along to the question.
Let's see. Can I talk about EF Core? Like people who were on EF6 and moving to EF Core, there was definitely a lot of reluctance there, and people needed to see it out in the wild, not just blog posts and stuff. That was really important for people to see that other people were using it, and then again that difference between with .NET Core 2 from 1.0 to 2.0, and then with EF Core it really was EF Core 2.2. For me, like there was just a couple extra things that really was like, yes, now it has the things that I want in it. And I think so companies watch that and pay attention to that. And then, reluctance to move to EF Core, any ORM, there's always going to be the people who just want to, write their own SQL and have that comfort level. They want to just have their own stuff, and I am not like ever there to like proselytize like, oh, you have to use Entity Framework. One thing I always talk about with people is kind of the 80-20 rule. I think something like an Entity Framework or an ORM, it's going to take care of probably 80% of just the basic stuff that you're doing, and then 20% go and write your own store procedures and views and use your own logic. Then you've got a huge benefit from using it. But yeah, I don't see the kind of pushback that we saw with Entity Framework at the beginning. I think people have, it's been around for a really long time. People have kind of gotten used to it now.
Scott, you're nodding along.
Well, I just had an experience about 2 months ago sitting with a team that their argument basically came down to 2 reasons. One reason was that they were afraid a user would be able to do something in the database that the user wasn't supposed to be able to do. And for that reason, they wanted everything to go through stored procedures. But when I sat down and really dug into that, I said, do you actually flow the user identity through to the database call? Well, no, we have a connection string. I'm like, well then, even if you had a stored procedure, you wouldn't actually know who that user is unless you somehow pass along some ID or some token. So my point of this is going to be that if you don't use the entity framework, that's fine. Just make sure you do it for valid reasons. And their other argument was a little bit harder to talk them out of this one, but they basically believe that iQueryable is too powerful to put into the hands of developers. So
that's right. That's correct.
And for that reason, they want all their SQL code to be lovingly handcrafted artesian style. Ooh. And that's a hard argument
and
to win
that's a different kind of problem too, when they don't trust the developers.
Right.
Yeah.
A software shop?
It was a software shop. Yeah,
Doesn't trust the developers. Well.
Well, the DBA didn't trust the
Oh,
developer.
that's okay. That's okay. Yes, we
That's where I see
understand
most
that.
of the reluctance as well, as the database people.
Always take a big bag of M&Ms when you go talk to the DBAs.
Data's always been
Bribe
like
them.
the data access area of any stack has always been fairly vehemently protected, right? It's like data is still king, queen, emperor, right? It is really, really important to a company, and like making a data access or control decision that changes the status quo in a company, in my experience, has always been never taken lightly. So I totally understand a lot of the the emotion around data access libraries and data access techniques and ORMs and all the rest of it. And I'll just say, use what makes you happy. Whatever works for you is fine. But again, to Scott's point, do it for good reasons, and don't have a problem with sitting down and talking about it and reevaluating as new technologies become available. But if it works for you, knock yourself out.
When I showed in a client, the DBAs were really fighting against it because there was one really dumb query that was just taking a really long time. And I said, go write a stored procedure and bring it back to me, right? And we put the stored procedure in there and said, for this hard thing, let's use your intelligence and your experience to solve the problem. And then, the DBA was like, oh, okay. Right? Like I'll be responsible for the stuff you really need me for, and then let Entity Framework take care of all the dumb stuff. It's like AI, right? Right? AI can take care of the easy stuff, and then let the human people do the creative work.
All right, David, if you could rewrite .NET entirely without worrying about backward compatibility
Free time on your
or
hands.
breaking changes or
gonna
established
leave right now.
conventions, what would you change?
Oh, I'm gonna have a heart attack. Okay, it's all good. Right.
Project files. I'm kidding.
He went there straight off.
Not again. Solution files probably.
Yes,
it would be
I agree with
a
that
big one. Solution files are just terrible. There was an effort about 3 years ago to try and make a new solution file. It failed miserably. I'm hoping it will come back again because I really want to be a consistent format for MS Build. I wish it wasn't XML. Not YAML, but not something else. I think one big thing, C# is too verbose. I think it comes from its roots of Java. I kind of wish it was more terse. One thing I see is when I interview students from college, they know Python and some in Java, but it's Python and like JavaScript. And I think the barrier to entry, like to write a C# hello world, you have to do namespace, class, method. And
What you're using.
And you're this far in to the file before doing like console write line. In Python, you just print hello world, right? So I think thinking about making C# more verbose for kind of entry level people would be a big thing. Also, I changed the naming of some things. Beginning Asp Net Core, we tried super hard to change the name. Do you know how hard to search for Asp Net? The Asp Net, that term, active server pages, is just tainted. It took like 5 years to get core to mean something good. 5 years is just like bad search terms, bad things. .NET is a strong brand, but it doesn't really appeal to the people who knew it was before, like 20 years ago. So I think, I don't know, some cool name like not Node, Nodes, Nodes.net.
So the one thing you could change is like some marketing crap.
Marketing
not
stuff.
actually some engineering thing.
No,
Okay.
well, some other things. I think C# is too object oriented, so maybe some more structural type matching, duck typing in the runtime.
I'd like that.
That's one thing that I think Go does really well in their BCL. Every single method in library in C# has like no checking for every single argument. So you start a method and it's like this long. If argument is not null, throw exception, you have like just bunch of bloat that I really hate seeing every method. And I wish we could figure out how to make things more concise and just look like the code you want to see.
As a language feature
As
rather than some add-on thing.
Yeah, it's really kind of painful to read, I think.
That's not much. That's not as bad as I thought.
Isn't
It'd
it?
be. Yeah. I mean, I agree
This
with all
isn't
those
being
things.
video-
Well, we
Videotaped,
tried
is
blowing
it?
up the world once.
We'll say no.
I'm a bit more tempered now. We tried packages that didn't work at all.
No, that didn't work at all.
The NPM thing, like we tried making. Remember .NET Core 1.0? You guys all were part of that, right?
Everything was a package.
All packages. That was amazing. You could change anything. System runtime could be different from system threading. If you wanted collections, you have to ask for it. Like that seemed cool in theory. We all loved it, but in practice, people hated it. I think.
It was not amazing.
Yeah,
No,
so now I'm a bit more
not
I'm a bit more dialed back into like maybe XML is okay. Maybe it's fine. Maybe
Anyone else want to chime in?
We haven't chimed in enough yet.
Oh, well,
Well,
Chatty
that
group.
defensive code to me is something that gets under my skin too, because it's difficult to open up a C# file and look at a public method, and it's almost like seeing ads on the right side of the browser. Your mind just skips over all that validation code to try to get to the heart of what's going on. And most of my career has been either C, C++, C#, and a lot of JavaScript, and all those languages I've had to deal with that, right? I've always had to have a lot of defensive coding to make sure that someone didn't pass you a bad argument, or, we could make an argument that in JavaScript it was even worse because you had to wrap things in these weird syntax ifs just to make sure you didn't have a global escape. So over all of that, and it's what appeals. It's what makes F# appeal to me as a language, like getting rid of some of that noise and being more terse about things. That being said, I think the null checks coming out in C# I think will be good.
all right. Scott, when writing software, there are many ways to do it well, but far more ways to do it badly that still work and meet business needs. Do you think languages like C# and frameworks like .NET and tools that are around that should guide us in the right direction?
I think to some extent, yes. I think that it always worries me when you talk about language changes, because I don't know what's going to be different 5 or 10 years from now when it comes to language changes. And specifically, if I think about things like async and await in C#, yes, it makes it easy to do async programming, and it's very easy in the easy case. But then you have, David has to write entire wikis about how you can screw things up with async and await. And that worries me, that feature in the language is so hard to misuse. And then the framework, too. I think it's easier to make framework changes that help people. So if I think about the struggles I used to have with HTTP client, anyone have HTTP client headaches? I mean, you were basically screwed with that class no matter what you did. If you dispose it like you're supposed to, then socket starvation. If you keep one around forever, then you're not going to do A/B deployments. You're not going to have failovers. So you're screwed no matter what you do. And so those types of situations are the situations I'd like to see the framework address aggressively. Of course, some of them you don't find out about until it's been out and you've seen it in use for a few years, and that's why using previews are so important, as risky as it can be for a lot of us.
But even things like using exceptions for flow control, I've seen people doing that. Do you think a framework or a library should warn you, or the Visual Studio should jump in and say,
Absolutely,
bad idea?
absolutely. And I think warnings should be errors.
by default.
Okay.
By default, yes, yeah. Anyone else?
Yeah.
Warnings as errors, yeah.
Julie, David, Damien, got any ideas on this?
Yeah, we spent
We spent a lot of
time
arguing about this.
'cause we see a lot of code like in our daily job, emails from people at Microsoft, outside of Microsoft, and that wiki actually came from me reading people's code and going, we're never gonna get this right. There is a lot of fear in the team themselves for if we want to add new paradigms. So async await, like copied in Rust, JavaScript, Python, like works really well, we think, in general. But legacy code kind of comes in, and you're kind of like, well, you have legacy code and new code. New code is beautiful. They both interact, and then things off the rails, right?
Yep.
And we haven't found a way to kind of bridge that gap yet. So people are fearsome for adding new models that can solve the problem. And now we have sync, old async, new async, and new async.
Yeah.
4 things. Like, what do you do now?
All right, it's like the SQL client. Like
Yes.
That's I think that's a perfectly great way to solve that problem. Just have another library.
Right.
Right.
There's 2.
And that
Now there's two.
particular
Oh, yeah.
problem, because that was a big problem.
Damien, what's going to happen with .NET Core 3 when .NET 5 comes along? Will there be rewrites for us?
Well,
Yep.
no.
Oh, you heard it here first.
Depends on who you mean by us.
Us outside Microsoft, the rest of the world.
No. So I mean, as the platform, we're talking about breaking changes, and we take that very seriously now. The reality is that as the platform gets more mature, we are, as it is now, .NET Core is coming out to its third release. We have 1 million active monthly users who have been using .NET Core this year, which is fantastic. It was a good milestone to get over. We have to be careful, and we need to find that flexibility between changing things that are obviously broken, sometimes for the reasons you've talked about just now. Like, we don't want people to fall into pits of failure that we talk about. We want people to be set up for success, and we want the tools to help them do that. We want the language to help them do that. We want the framework to help them to do that. There's lots of layers here that have to work well together in order to make you successful, to make the developer successful. But we have a lot of legacy that we also have to interact with. We can't make a clean break every year, or every 2 years, or even every 5 years. We got one, right? We got one, and it was 16 years after we did the first one. We don't get another one. This is our shot. And so we have to figure out how to ensure that now we're on this new release cadence, which is every year, we now set a build this year, every year there will be a new major version of .NET Core, and every alternate version will be a long-term support release. So .NET 5 will not be long-term support. .NET 5 is next November 2020, and it will be the next major version after .NET 3. There will be a .NET 3.1 before the end of this year, which will be long-term support. So moving from .NET 3 or 3.1 to 5 will be trivial. It shouldn't be a big change at all. Whether you're using Asp Net or WinForms, yeah, I know, I see the eyebrows, don't worry. The WinForms, the WPF, console apps, whatever it is you're doing. I'm not saying there won't be any breaking changes. Of course there will be, there always are. But the reality is, other than that auth breaking change we made between 1 and 2, a lot of the time, in Asp Net at least, right now, most of the breaking changes we end up making are things that affect program main and the startup class, and pretty much nothing else in your app. There's 2 files in your whole app, right? Because sometimes we have to change platform level things or composite, like endpoint routing, right? It's a great example in 3.0. To get the benefit, you have to move to the new API. So you could consider that a break, and you can't use some of the new features until you've moved to the new API. So you have to go in, think about that, rewrite a small portion of your startup class, and then you're off to the races. There are smaller breaking changes throughout the rest of it, but they are really small. Like, I can't think of anything that you would have to go and change in multiple files, like a find replace or anything like that. And even the ones that we did make, most of them are really esoteric. Like, we make some change that was a type that was public is now internal, but it's a type no one ever, or a constructor that was public is now gone. And it was a constructor you would never have called because you're all using DI to get it anyway, right? So it would have been created for you. So those are the type of breaking changes that we tend to be making right now. I can't think of one that we would make in 5. I mean, never say never. We don't know what's going to happen in the next 6 to 8 months, and we haven't even started yet.
We have changed the platform 3 times, though.
We have, but I think the third one, the new one, is going to be the last one. It's perfect
you're
now.
right.
Now, we went from packages, and we added the Runtime store, then we went to shared framework, and in 3.0, we have composable shared frameworks. We're kind of at the pinnacle, and now you can use multiple shared frameworks. They can inherit from each other. And so far, given the landscape of what we can see in front of us, that's enough composition.
There's one more thing coming, for sure.
Yeah, probably.
Yep.
But whether it will break anything, I don't know.
Maybe not.
I think the new thing, if we do it, will compose on top of what we have.
It will.
And so it won't break anyone. It'll just be a new tool that you have available to you. So, yes, no rewrite. Rewrite is a strong word.
Yeah.
Yes, you'll have to make some changes. You'll have to retarget your app to 5. It is a major version. But yeah, I think we'll be okay.
Yeah, that doesn't sound to me like you use that in context of, it's small, but it, maybe it's a breaking change, but rewriting something in order to take advantage of a new feature, that doesn't feel like something breaking to me. That feels like, like I'm just going to implement this new thing.
Right, and rewrite again is a strong term. Like moving from Asp Net to Asp Net Core, that's a rewrite. It really is. Moving from Asp Net Core 1 to 2 was not a rewrite. It was painful, but it wasn't a rewrite. And 2 to 2.1, most people did that in under a day. 2.1 to 2.2 was usually instant. You change your TFM, you update your packages, you're off to the races. 3.0 for most people will be an hour's work to move from 2x to 3.0. If you have a slightly more complicated application, it might take you a day, and then you're done. I mean, to me, that's pretty good investment, and you get advantage of all the new features. So,
yeah. Now with the entity framework, the kinds of changes they're making in the query pipeline, those could have I don't know if they're breaking changes, but behavioral changes.
Yep.
So I think tests are going to be integration tests are going to be really, really important there
Absolutely.
to make sure that stuff stays consistent, working the way you anticipate.
I'm worried about the meaning of major versions if we do them so often, personally. So shipping super often is really
For
great.
us. The rest
for,
of the
for
industry
us.
does it. But
So like major every year, right?
Yep.
What does that mean? Does that mean you're not fixing bugs every year, or does that mean you're doing features every year?
Whatever
So
we want.
it is, but Semver means things. So Semver
Yeah.
means like minors or like fixes and patches, and
Well, we patch every month.
we're still gonna patch.
You know that. Yeah.
But imagine there's 3.0, then 3.1, then 5.
Yep.
Like wow. That seems like
It's just a
even
number.
though it just is a number,
just a number.
it feels big to me.
Okay.
It feels like okay,
Yeah, but
wow.
isn't that something you usually make Kathleen Dollard explain?
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I don't have to
You put
explain it.
Kathleen out there, like let Kathleen give this news and explain to people because everybody trusts her. If she says this is good, it's hard, but it's good for everybody. I'd be like, if Kathleen
good
said
for you
it's
all.
okay. I trust her.
Scott, anything on this?
No, I think that covers everything.
So I'm going to open it up to audience questions. We have two people with microphones, and Niall at the front already has one for us. I'll repeat it if you want to.
Next greatest security feature in .NET or Core 3.
Niall is asking about what will be the next greatest security feature.
Or beyond, I'll take 5.
Okay. So the question was, what's the next greatest security?
Oh, sorry, one thing. If you want to ask a question, please let the two people at the sides with microphones know so that they can get to you while this one's being answered.
So there was a recent proposal put together on how we would go about deprecating APIs moving forward, including in the BCL. And that's something that we've just never really done in Core FX layer. We've done it in Asp Net Core. We've already started doing it in the last couple of versions. Our pattern now is we typically mark the API obsolete in one major version, like in one of the minors within a major, and then we'll delete it in the next major. So there's a bunch of APIs that were marked obsolete in 2.2 or 2.1. They're gone in 3.0 in Asp Net Core. They've never done that for Core FX before. But now there's a proposal put together on how to potentially do that. And one of the big reasons is for security. So when things just become unsafe, we can actually have a path to delete them.
What about third parties?
What about third parties?
Packages.
What
On
about
NuGet.
them? What about
Can you deprecate a NuGet package?
So that's another
That's a big
feature
one
that's
too,
coming.
right?
So right now, the only thing you can really do on NuGet is unlist a package, which just stops it showing up in search results. But they are working on the ability to, just similar to what NPM has done,
Yep.
to be able to have a package declare that
Deprecate.
it is deprecated and here's why, and with a recommendation of what you should do instead. I think all the way up to it won't even let you use it anymore for like the most critical problems.
That's mean.
Well, it's about trust,
break
right?
your
Sometimes
builds.
you have to be mean to be. Well, then mirror feeds if that's important to you.
Pad.
Exactly. Left pad.
I think we have another question from a gentleman with a microphone there. And there's another person up here that would like to ask a question.
Does it work? Oh my God, you got a microphone. Okay, so what's your opinion for companies where most services are still running on .NET Framework? Is the strategically best time to migrate to .NET Core right now on 2.2, right? Or wait for .NET 5? Will the gap get smaller or not?
The gap won't get smaller.
Yeah.
So if you think waiting for .NET 5 will make it easier to move from .NET Framework, it won't.
Yeah.
.NET Core 3 is the tipping point in the sense of like API surface area, workloads that are supported, workloads meaning application types, WinForms, Asp Net Core. We've already announced WCF will not be coming to .NET 5, WebForms will not be coming to .NET 5. There are open source ports of workflow and WCF that were sponsored by Microsoft and being kicked off and are now being maintained by the community. The WCF one is super early, it's like 3 weeks old. So those might be options. So maybe if you really need that, you would wait for that or get involved with that. But in terms of .NET itself, I don't see anything being added in 5 that will make it easier. 3 is getting C++ CLI, it's getting VB, it's getting COM on
WinRT.
Windows, it's getting WinForms and WPF, like it's getting all the things that were big blockers for a lot of people. So
If you need web forms,
stay on .NET Framework. It'll be there forever.
pretty much a rewrite, yeah. So you either stay on Framework or you can be ambitious and create a project.
Or you can come up with a migration plan. That we've worked with companies who
Yeah.
have migrated from web forms. It just takes time.
Not just a backend code. So it's actually awesome to hear that because that's just the message I wanted to bring home.
Good.
Thank
It's
you.
recorded, right? So let's
I
briefly.
think the microphone is over here somewhere.
Hello. I was wondering, how satisfied or any unfulfilled visions you have for TVPs in SQL Client or EF? That whole experience for how we use TVPs.
I don't know what that is.
Table value.
Yeah, table value parameters.
Oh, okay.
I made that up, by the way.
Okay.
Julie?
I always get it mixed up between the support for table value parameters and table value functions. Aren't parameters, the parameters did eventually get supported.
They definitely work. I was just curious where
I kind of missed the
where your
question
heart
when the
was.
glass went.
For sure.
So could you ask just,
And to be fair, I'm kind of being a bit snarky about it.
so it's like a joke question?
No. I think they're awesome to use, but I feel like the experience with how I have to use them is not great. But I'm curious if it's on your mind at all.
Nope. Next question.
Gentleman over here.
Is this on? Hello. Yeah, there we go. So how much further along the explicitly managed memory path do you expect C# and .NET to go over time? Where do you think current limitations are, and how do you go about finding solutions to those that may involve changes to the language or the runtime?
And that's a good question. So speaking of security, this is the tension. This is one of the biggest tensions, I think, in the evolution of the platform moving forward with regards to language features and power, is how much power do we give developers through the language and through the type system and the runtime to do the type of explicit memory management that you're talking about, while keeping people like Niall and the rest of the security community happy, who have seen all the problems that are caused by that type of power. And the folks on the security folks on the .NET team publicly talk about this all the time. There was a thread on Twitter yesterday with Levi and because it was Kevin Jones made a comment, community member, and Levi and Barry kicked in. I don't know if you saw it. They were like, yes, please keep saying things like this because the language team wants to go and do all these crazy things.
We should.
Yeah, I don't know. To balance on stuff. So I will say, like Span, for example, which was the last big one like this, and what was it? Refstructs. Doing those things is really hard. Doing those things safely, and you know better than I do, is like super difficult. And they're obviously very smart people who are working on this, and they're worried. Like they really stress.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how much to say. So there's been experiments where we tried to look at, I want to say Rust. So people on the team love Rust, and they're trying to see if we could bring the same kind of thing to C#. And it's really ugly. It gets ugly really fast. Rust is a great language. I'm recording, right? It's a great language. If you get to compile, there are people looking at this stuff in both research and the language team, and there's collaboration between both teams trying to figure out what makes sense to bring to C# in real life. There's a ton of experiments in the wild, but I don't know if we'll see anything in real life for a couple of years because everyone's worried, especially the security team. Even adding span and buffer pooling to the BCL, like people lost their beep. Blew myself.
It's disciplined of you.
We still aren't very comfortable doing it yet. So
I saw the microphone went to the back.
Yeah. Hello. I didn't really hear the last question, so I'm sorry if this is the same one. But anyway,
Rust is great.
While the GC handles memory deallocation beautifully, resource deallocation is currently handled by what I think is a band-aid with iDisposable and the quite horrendous disposable pattern that offers little in terms of convenience over primitive languages such as C.
What?
Sorry. It makes
Dude,
me
your filter is epic. It's amazing.
It makes
Well, the
me
mic is on. I'm sorry.
I'll go on. It makes me as a programmer having to care about things that a modern programming language and or runtime should handle for me, I think. Are there any plans for something like per class opt-in automatic ref counting that guarantees that the finalizers run when my object goes out of its last scope, so I don't have to care about using blocks and chaining disposes and implementing verbose patterns, all of which I can and do get wrong?
There's new syntax in C#8 where you can do using var, so it's not as noisy.
So what you're saying is that's a step.
So like,
we're not there yet.
It doesn't feel as bad, but no, there's no plans to add ref counting to C. Well, no, to C# itself. There have been efforts that I've been a part of to do it in APIs, but people like freaked out again because it's super scary. Brought up COM memories, and everyone's kind of no, we can't go back to COM. C# is GC is magical. Disposable is probably your best bet, and if you want full control, just allocate memory yourself and just don't worry about
You can still
anything
do that.
else. But yeah, so there's no plans to have that kind of thing in Arc, I guess, like in C#.
Thank you.
F#.
I don't see the microphone. Oh, we have a
There's a
person.
hand there.
Hello. Question about C# features. Is there any plan to support algebraic data types like records or discriminated unions as an F#?
Yes.
How soon?
In
The next
future
the
version.
next version, they're looking at those things as the top.
They were looking at some of them,
priority.
and they got punted right early on.
They're looking at
Records.
in C# 8,
And
and
got-
then Inheritance made it super hard,
Right.
and then they punted the whole thing.
But
So
9
9 is it's
Okay.
in the, yeah.
and 9 is going to be around part of 5, I guess.
I assume
maybe?
so, yeah.
I don't know.
So yes, yeah, they are.
They are,
looking
okay.
at those two things specifically.
Thank you.
Anyone else? If you don't, I have a few. Gentleman over here.
Since we're on features, for a long time, the way you developed was sort of a mix of changing Visual Studio and the language and the libraries all together. So it was this overall mix. But now with .NET Core, with .NET Core, so much of the demos are in Visual Studio Code. How does that change how you feel about implementing features if you don't tie yourself so strongly to Visual Studio?
So it's an interesting question. And there's been folks internally who have wondered about whether it was wise to do so. It is different. You do have to think about it differently. So when we started Project K, right, which turned into .NET Core, we started with the command line first, project file first mentality, which is where Project JSON came from, packages first, CLI from the beginning, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we always saw it as a base that had to be very functional, that you could then layer on various different sort of developer environments. It was never intended that we would abandon the idea of a wonderfully integrated, vertical development environment with strong ties to where you run in production. I will say it was much easier when we owned the OS and the web server and the framework and the runtime and the template and the tool. Like it was all one thing and it was basically in one team. It was simpler, but it was also quite limiting, right? We going cross-plat was never going to happen doing it that way. And a lot of the other innovations we've made were really never going to be possible doing that. But yeah, it does change the way we think about things, and I will admit that it does result in things not landing in the same time sometimes. Like you don't land a full experience end-to-end in one release. We often end up with, well, there's a package available, you can go and try it, and there's a bit of docs over here, but there isn't any IntelliSense in VS, and there's no template, and there's no scaffolding, and right? And then over time, we look at how many folks are using it, and then we decide what to prioritize in terms of adding VS support and that type of thing. So it has changed those things. But personally, I love the fact that people can feel productive in VS Code or in Rider or in VS or in a web-based editor or just using the command line. I love that. And from what I've spoken to folks, most folks seem to like that too. The challenge is more on us to keep delivering those nice end-to-end solutions. I have heard the complaint. We still hear it. Where did the Visual and Visual Studio go? I hate that I have to edit my project file. And I agree. Like I like editing the project file, but I agree you shouldn't have to. There should be easy gestures in VS for doing all the mainline things that you should be able to do. And we're lagging behind that on a bunch of very important things right now. Even some of the stuff we showed today, which are mainline things that we know people want to do in 3.0, you probably won't be able to do with a dialogue in VS when we ship in September. It might take another 6 months for us to get that through.
Yeah, my hot take is that
Take.
we had a pendulum swing to command line because we were so Windows focused.
We were so far behind too.
I used a Mac for 3 years to not use Windows so I could be in that mindset. And it kind of hurt a little bit because I didn't test out VS for features and we wouldn't have good end-to-ends. So we have to find a balance between being not over Windows pivoted and still supporting the end-to-ends. It's mostly because the team grew up on Windows and we are still used to Windows. So if you want to be serious doing .NET, the cross-platform .NET development, you need to live in the other world, right? And having people live in that world, sometimes you forget about the world you have already. So now we're trying to figure out on team, how do we balance having people that are deeply experts in the other OSs, also and also having end-to-end experiences on VS and VS Code and VS for Mac. But it's challenging.
I saw gentleman here, so it's be the last question for the evening.
Doesn't work. All right, I'll just speak up. What do you think about ahead of time compilation? And for example, the Core RT project is very interesting, but lately I only see the mono ahead of time compiler being mentioned. Is Core RT still a thing, or?
I'll repeat it. So his gentleman's asking about ahead of time compilation, in particular about the RT project.
Yeah, we've had forms of AOT in .NET, since early on with the pre-jitting stuff that David talked about before, NGen stuff, and they're only sort of mild forms. It's just we're trying to save some work up front. There was an experimental project that parts of the .NET Runtime team started a while ago called Core RT. It's up on GitHub. There's been quite a bit of interest from areas of the community on that. And then we announced as part of .NET 5 that we wanted to try and merge some of the great tooling from Mono with the core CLR stuff as well, and basically make where it comes from isn't really important, but what we want to do in .NET 5 and moving forward is have good options for JIT-based compilation as well as good options for AOT, and so we care about it a lot. Where it lands yet, I'm not really sure, because .NET 5 is not even what I'm thinking about shipping .NET 3 at the moment, .NET Core 3. But in short, we care about it a lot, and I think we'll see development there over the next few months.
All right, I'm going to call a halt to it. Scott Allen, Julie Lerman, David Fowler, Damien Edwards, thank you very much for your time this evening. Thank you.